This lesson is about carbon and carbohydrates. A carbon is unique as an atom because it can bond up to it can share electrons with four other atoms. Now that's significant because of that configuration. Carbon can cause these molecules to make long chains and even rings. That allows large complex organic molecules basically to happen. So organic molecules are large, they're complex, they're carbon-based, and they're associated with living things. Now, carbon can form four bonds, and here's an example of carbon molecules, carbon-based molecules, in the form of rings and branches and chains. So letter A is showing you just this long chain of carbons. B is showing you a branching configuration, and C is showing you a ring configuration. The two lines in between those carbons represent double bonds. So there's two electrons being shared between those two carbon atoms. The H stands for hydrogen. These large molecules are made up of smaller molecules. We call the smaller molecules monomers, the individual units, and then the large one is a polymer. So each organic molecule is going to have this type of characteristic where the monomer makes up the polymer. Carbohydrates are no exception. Carbo just stands for carbon. Hydrate stands for, in this case, water, like you're hydrated. So carbon is basically one C and an H2O, and it's in that ratio. So when you look at a carbohydrate, no matter how complex or simple it might be, it's made up of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. If you take a look at this glucose, that's a carbohydrate. We can figure out the chemical formula. Now this is a picture of the way glucose looks structurally, but we want to figure out the chemical formula. So first we count the C's and we find there's 6 of them, so C6. Then we count the hydrogens. We'll find that there's 12 of them, so C6H12. Then count the oxygens. You'll find there's 6 of those, C6H12O6. You'll notice then all these simple sugars have that same basic formula, C6H12O6. They all have 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, 6 oxygens. But notice they're not put together the same way. Their structure is different. Those are called isomers. Isomers are where you have the same chemical formula but a different structure. There's 2 main types of carbohydrates. There's the simple ones, monosaccharides and disaccharides. That's mono, 1 sugar, di, 2 sugars. Polysaccharide, many sugar. You'll notice that no matter how complex carbohydrates get, the chemical formula is basically the same, a carbon and then a water. So if I take C6H12O6 and I add those 2 simple sugars together, I get a disaccharide, C12H22O11. But you notice anything odd about that disaccharide? It should be C12H24O12, but we've lost 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen, a water. Every time these simple sugars come together, there's a water loss. That's called dehydration synthesis. Dehydration, we lose water. Synthesis, we bring it together. It's a very common process through all these organic molecules. That whenever the monomers join together to make the polymer, each time there's a chemical bond, usually it's water that's being lost. So monosaccharides, disaccharides, polysaccharides are the types of carbohydrates. Monosaccharides are simple sugars. You'll notice that they all have this OSE in common, glucose, fructose, galactose. Disaccharides means we need to combine 2 of those monosaccharides. And when we do, there's always a glucose involved. All right, so every time. Maltose are 2 glucose units, that's green sugar. Lactose are a glucose and a galactose unit, and that's milk sugar, dairy sugar. Sucrose, glucose and fructose, that's table sugar. Polysaccharides are large complex sugars like starch, glycogen, cellulose. Starch is how plants store energy. Glycogen is how animals store energy. Cellulose is plant structural material. We can't digest it, but we call it fiber. So it's good for you to eat it, but we can't digest it. So here's an example of a polysaccharide. Notice it's a polymer. So polysaccharide, many sugars, these sugar units, glucose molecules. And those glucose molecules are storing energy, and they're storing them in the chemical bonds. So polysaccharides are going to have way more energy because they have way more chemical bonds than a single glucose unit would have. We use carbohydrates primarily for energy, and there's energy stored in chemical bonds. It's 4 calories per gram. And if you take a look at this nutrition information, you'll see the total carbohydrates, that's the all the sugars together. The dietary fiber, that's the cellulose. The simple sugars, like monosaccharides and disaccharides. So if I take the dietary fiber, 6, and the sugars, 2, that means there's 10 grams of complex carbohydrates in that food. 10 grams of complex carbohydrates. To get the total carbohydrate calories, though, I'm going to have to take 18 times 4. Once we eat sugar, it raises our blood sugar level or our blood glucose level. Then our body secretes a hormone called insulin. Insulin allows that sugar to leave our bloodstream and enter cells that need it, because this is really the cells that need energy, not the bloodstream. So high blood sugar just means we've got lots of sugar in our bloodstream, but it's not doing any good for our cells. So insulin helps get it into our cells. A type 1 diabetic does not make insulin. So they need to give themselves an insulin shot to get that sugar out of their blood and into the cells that need it. We don't just use carbohydrates for energy, although that's the primary use. We also eat things like cellulose, and that's useful for regular bowel movements. But occasionally we use carbohydrates for anatomical structures. You'll notice in the cell membrane, there are some carbohydrate chains that make up the structure of that cell membrane. That's a quick little overview of carbohydrates, their structure, what they consist of, and what they're useful for.